So I have to be real with all of you. I have been panicking over the last several weeks over something that is really bothering me. You might think this is silly, but I am still struggling with the fact that I only have about 8 science fiction books published in 2024 that I like enough to put forward for my top 10 list. Now, a lot of you in previous videos have commented saying, don't worry, just make a top 8 video or a top 9 if you find one more. But I really like the number 10 and I'm kind of stuck with that. It's in my head and I think I have enough time to read those books. I just need to find the good ones. So I'm going to talk about the science fiction I've been reading recently, trying to round out that video. I have found some books I liked, but are they going to make the cut? I'm not sure, as well as some fantasy books I'll be talking about because of course I'm trying to round out that video. But as I said before, fantasy is easy. There's so much being published that it's not too hard to find 10 that I really like. And if that sounds good, if you're in the same struggle situation, love to hear it down below. All that being said, let's get started. All right, let's start with Usurpation by Sue Burke. I'm really hoping I'm saying that right. This is the third and final book in the trilogy that begins with Symbiosis, a book that I read earlier this year. And I can't talk too much about the plot points of this one because it will spoil what comes before. But the basic setup of the first book is that we follow these individuals that are on this planet that potentially has some sentient plants, and then we follow those colonists through the generations. And so that continues on into the next book and then into this one. And so in terms of plot, I actually quite enjoyed this one because it is quite futuristic at this point, and I enjoyed hearing and learning about how the technology all comes together in the different ways that it is presented. So there's a lot I liked about this book. I liked but didn't love the first book. I liked but didn't love the second, and I very much feel the same. So if you're someone who adored the first book and the second, I think you'll really enjoy this one, and it might be a favorite of the year for you because I appreciate the series a little bit more than I personally connect with it. I find it interesting but not engrossing or as exciting or capturing my imagination the way I'd love it to. It's not good enough for me to put on my own top 10 list, but I very much recommend it to the right audience. I think if you're the type of person who loves ideas in science fiction and loves something a little bit more intellectual or cerebral, definitely give it a try. While it wasn't quite a hit for me, it's still something I enjoyed, appreciated, and did have a relatively good time reading. Next is A Dark Space by Rob Hart and Alex Segura, and this is one that follows different characters that are on this ship that is going to go and leave our solar system, and so we follow them along the way. This is one that is kind of described as a space opera mixed with a spy thriller, all set in space. And I think that it's an interesting mix of some genres here. You have some different characters, and definitely I'd recommend this to those of you that love science fiction but also enjoy Cold War fiction because it is very much centered around that narrative of the warring factions and countries. And for me, I liked a lot of parts of this book. I thought that it was well written in places. I found parts interesting, and it's very much the idea of a solid science fiction book that checked a lot of boxes I'm looking for. If you're looking for a good 4-star read, I would recommend it. But if I'm honest, as you can probably tell from the way I'm talking about this book, is it just never really got me excited. I think it had a lot of potential to have some great twists and turns and aha moments, and while they are technically there, I never felt that emotional pull. I never felt overly attached to the characters in the way that they were presented. And again, I think the book is doing a lot of things right. I would still recommend it to those of you that are just looking for a good science fiction story and just wanting to have a good time in the genre. It wasn't necessarily the most memorable, moving read that typically is the kind of thing I like to put as a favorite of the year for me, but it certainly was an enjoyable time. And I do think that if you're interested in it, if you love the idea of mixing space adventure with some spy thriller, politicking, I think that there is some good things to see here. Now from there, I didn't want to waste any more time. Instead, I really wanted to go and just hit the nail on the head. So instead of looking for something off the beaten path, I knew that Neal Stephenson had a new 2024 release coming out. So I did something I rarely do, and I pre-ordered a copy because I didn't get a review copy. And because he is a favorite author of mine, I've read most of his backlist and loved most of that. I felt quite confident that this was an easy win, an easy book to get onto that list. And so I did know the general plot going in, that it was more of a piece of historical fiction. And so we follow this woman who is growing up in historical Russia, and she does move around throughout the story. There's potentially some aspects involving getting into spy work and different pieces. I don't like to give away a lot of the plot, but for me it was this really interesting piece of fiction that again explored a part of the world in a time period that I know pieces about, but really only superficially. And so I love that what Neal Stephenson does, he does so well, is really allowing a deep dive and getting a chance to have him geek out about his knowledge, the things that he has learned and researched, and sharing that with the audience. So the same thing he does in science fiction, he did here with historical fiction. And certainly he does come with that love of science, because while this book is not technically science fiction, he still manages to include some paragraphs, some what I'll call light info dumps on topics adjacent to that. So very much looking at education and different aspects of how we use technology in that time period and all of that. And so I really loved it because I love Neal Stephenson. I wouldn't actually recommend starting here because I don't think it's the best example of his work. It's probably most similar to Quicksilver and its sequels, which I really did love, but again are more adjacent to science fiction. And so I actually did really like this book a lot. I gave it 4 stars, but if I'm honest, it's not really science fiction. I'm kind of cheating it putting it in this video, and if I put it in my top 10, I'm kind of cheating if I do that. But if I'm honest, I'm pretty tempted to, because I really need another book in that video, and it was a solid one. I do think a lot of people who love science fiction and love Neal Stephenson science fiction will love this one too, even if it's kind of more historical fiction, but maybe I can get away with it. Let me know if I'm allowed to cheat in my own top 10. Now, I'll be frank, at this point I was getting pretty desperate, and I was really looking for different ways to explore science fiction in book form and looking for different angles. So I decided to look at some adaptations of other creative works. I found out that there was an adaptation of this role-playing game called Archimedes. I am not familiar with it whatsoever. However, the author who did that adaptation happened to be the Peter F. Hamilton, a renowned space opera writer, and so I decided to take a chance and I picked up this really hefty book called Exodus. And so this is a story that is set thousands of years after humanity has left a dying Earth. They sent out various ARC ships to go and find a new planet to settle on. Eventually they found one, and then they signaled to the other ships to come there, and so we're following them as these last ARC ships are arriving, and we're following them within the colony where it exists. In terms of a story that has like big stakes, it's exciting in nature. I actually thought this one ticked a lot of good boxes. I enjoyed parts of it. I think it really starts with a bang, and it is very long, but I think that that is something that Peter F. Hamilton fans really enjoy, because he tends to write really chunky books that you can just live in for a long time. It really takes the time to explore the characters, and I think even more so the world building. I really did love those aspects to this one. I liked it, but again, if I'm honest, when I finished it, while I objectively think it ticks a lot of boxes I was looking for, I wasn't overly excited for it. I wouldn't be overly compelled to read another book in the series unless I was once again desperately looking for new release science fiction. I think if you're a fan of the RPG, it's probably even more exciting to see such a fantastic, talented author writing within these worlds. But for me, without that connection, I found this one to be solidly good, but again, something that's a little bit forgettable. Despite the amount of time, the number of pages I spent reading this book, it's not the kind of thing that I found had a lasting impression, and even just a week after finishing it, I really don't have that much to say about it, despite, again, the effort I put in reading such a long book. I really wish I had loved it a little bit more. Again, a book I recommend. Will it be a favorite? No. And finally, for science fiction, let's talk about The Relentless Legion by J.S. Stew's, the third and final book in the trilogy that starts with The Last Watch. I don't want to spoil this book, so I'll talk about the basic beginnings of the first. And so in that one, we follow those that are rejected from society, that are sent off to guard against what I'm going to call the edge of the universe. I know that's not technically quite right, but basically sent to protect these outer walls. The premise of this book is kind of compared to the Watchers of the Wall in Game of Thrones, the same idea where you send the unlikable people, you send them off to do a job that no one else wants to do. And so I really love the premise of that one. It's gritty, it's dark, it has, again, some unlikable characters, but they're very multifaceted. And as you read the book, you get to like them and appreciate them. And of course, within this first story, without saying too much, it turns out that there actually is a threat. They aren't really just doing nothing out there. And so when something actually happens, they're the first ones to react and have to, again, guard against what is coming. And so we follow the same setup and then having the story advance into the second and the third book. I enjoyed the series. It's one that I like, but I'll be honest again, it's a series I like, but is it a favorite series of all time? Not necessarily. And while I think this was a solid ending book, again, if you really like the first book and the second and want to see it through, I don't think you're going to be disappointed. I enjoyed my time with this one, but again, I felt like it was somewhat predictable, somewhat safe, having the conclusion I would expect. Given the scope of the story, I just don't think it was going to do something out of the box, and it didn't. So it very much met my expectations, but unfortunately my expectations meant that it wasn't the favorite of the year that I wanted it to be. So if you're keeping track as you watch this video, you might have noticed that at this point, I only have one book that I would add to my favorites of the year for science fiction, and that book isn't actually science fiction, so I'm kind of in trouble here. At this point, I am currently rereading through the new releases I have already reviewed on my channel for the year, and I'm desperately hoping that one of them is something that I missed, I perhaps skipped over and didn't properly appreciate something that I read earlier. And I'll let you know that there is one book I am reading right now that I am loving, and I think I made a big mistake when I gave it an average review several months ago, much earlier in the year, and so I'm not going to let you know what that is until you watch my end of the year video. I think I have it figured out. I think we made it to 10. But if I'm honest, it's been a struggle, and I really hope that 2025 will be a stronger year for science fiction. But I think I missed one fantastic book. I think I let one book get an average rating when it actually was something special. And I'll talk about which book I reread and why it is now a favorite in that upcoming video. So hopefully you stick around and subscribe. I'm going to let you guess in the comments down below. See if you can figure out what book I am going to uplift and upgrade to a favorite of the year that I previously gave the short stick to. Now let's switch over to fantasy, which again is so much easier to find favorites, and there's just way more being published, so it's easier to find something that's to my taste. The first book I want to talk about is The Blood Dim Tide by Stephenson. This is the second book in an epic fantasy series that is inspired by historical Mongol culture, and so we follow the characters in this one, picking up from the events of the first book. Now I really enjoyed the first book because I am quite fascinated by historical Mongolia and Genghis Khan and all of the events that surround that time period. I liked that one, but my small issue with it at the time is that I felt like it was a very short book that didn't have as much world building as I wanted to. I wanted to spend more time in the world and have more character development. This book is exactly the answer I needed to how I felt after finishing the first, that I wanted more. And naturally, as a sequel, we got more time with the characters, more time on the world building, and it left me so much more satisfied because it gave me the extra time I needed to really appreciate this world. I also feel like the writing, which was already good, just got stronger in this one. It just feels like a very mature sophomore sequel. And so if you like the first book, if you love the first book, if you haven't read the first book, in that case, go read that book first because you do want to read these in order. But highly recommend this series. It went from a series I liked to a series I now love, and I believe there is another book coming, at least one more, and I'm dying to get my hands on that. Next up, we have The Shadow of the Gods by Gwynne. This is the third and final book in the trilogy that begins with The Shadow of the Gods. This is a piece of epic fantasy inspired by Viking culture, and specifically it follows multiple perspectives. The one perspective that's always mentioned at the beginning is you have this mother who right at the beginning of the story, there's an event that happens, and then the story progresses with her having to search for her son. Now, this is one that I really love because of that motherly connection. I think of the perspective, she's immediately the one I was most attached to, but certainly you have some great other perspectives that have their own storylines, their own motivations, and you follow them throughout the time. In this one, I don't want to talk about the specific events, but I found it to be a really solid conclusion. With the characters we're following at this point, you see how their storylines link together. It has some big moments and excitement. This story is a great balance of having some exciting moments, but also some intimate character development as well, and I thought it had good payoffs. I will say that it's generally predictable in terms of what I expected this book to be in terms of a conclusion, but that doesn't diminish my enjoyment of it. I thought that the writing was consistent, the character work was well done, and everything felt earned and just very satisfying. This is a series that has always been a 4-star read for me, so once again, this is a 4-star finale. But again, if you're someone who loves the first books even more, you will undoubtedly really be happy with this last book. I think it is solid on the same level and is exactly what I was looking for and expecting in this one in the best possible way. Next up is Red Sonja Consumed by Gail Simone, and this is a story that follows a woman who is a barbarian and a she-devil and very much takes what she wants. It's a very violent story with this strong but very stereotypical female character. I realized as I was preparing for this video that I was actually unaware that there is a character that this book is referencing and turning, I believe, what is more of a comic book style character into a novel. And I'll be honest, this book just did not work for me. I don't think I'm the main audience for it, and had I perhaps known about or loved the references to the original work, this original character, maybe I'd feel differently, so take that with a grain of salt. But reading it as a standalone, just treating it as an individual creative work, I found this character to be so incredibly flat. The story just feels very stereotypical. I've seen other reviewers complain that it's too mature, or too violent, or things like that. Keep in mind that those are not complaints for me. Simply, this book just felt very one-dimensional, and it felt like someone trying to write the archetype of a strong woman instead of actually creating a character who is a person first instead of this particular character design. And it just felt very hollow. I'm not someone who's overly excited about action scenes for the sake of action if there isn't plot and character development underneath it that I care about. And so this one just left me really hollow. Big disappointment, not for me. Again, if you love the universe that this book exists within, maybe you'll feel differently, so keep that all in mind. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? Thanks for coming along as I panic read towards the end of the year. If you have any more 2024 science fiction books you don't think I've read yet, make sure to drop them in the comments down below. And also, again, I'd love for you to guess what is the 2024 sci-fi release that I reviewed earlier this year that I am now revising my review. I made a mistake. I was unfair to this book. This book is amazing, and I'm going to talk about it at the end of the year, hopefully along with 9 other books. All that being said, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit that little notification bell, and I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.